mentioned this morning, we're looking at Genesis chapter 10 tonight. If you'd like to turn over there in your Bibles. If you've already taken a look at it, you might think, well, there's really no reason to turn over there because all it is a bunch of names. And it is one of those chapters in the Bible where we're given one of those genealogies where it just seems like an endless list of names. But as with all those genealogies, there is a purpose behind God giving them to us. And one of the reasons I think that God gave them to us is it kind of gives us an idea and a direction as to where all the nations of the earth came from. And that's what's really going to be our focus here in our study tonight. We're going to be talking about the beginning of nations. Now, I do want to point out that there were probably, I don't know if there were or not, before the time of Noah and before the flood, if there were different nations. It could very well be the case that they all spoke one language, that they were all together. Of course, it would make sense that Noah and his family spoke the same language. And so when they began to repopulate the earth, all of their descendants would have followed in their footsteps. And so one of the questions becomes, how did we get all these different people, and how did we get all these different languages? Well, as you look through the book of Genesis, what you might have noticed thus far is there's kind of a style to the book of Genesis. And the style is basically one man is focused upon. That man is followed to the end of his life. His descendants are introduced very briefly. A little bit of background is given about every one of them. And then the main focus or the spotlights goes to one of those man's descendants. And then the cycle just kind of repeats itself again. And so let me kind of remind you where we are in our study. In Genesis chapter 9, we have the end of Noah. We have his life coming to an end. He's been focused upon for several chapters now in the book of Genesis. His descendants, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are introduced. We're given a brief story about Ham and how that's going to affect some of the background of what's going to happen in the future. And then the focus really becomes upon Shem and his descendants. And of course, that in chapter 12 is going to spill over into the story of Abraham. And then, of course, you have all those other men, Jacob and Isaac and so on, down to Joseph through the book of Genesis. But it is kind of interesting just to notice the style of the book itself. Now, what we've learned in Genesis chapter 9 is the activities and the actions of Ham are going to carry some consequences for his descendants. Remember that Noah made the pronouncement in Genesis chapter 9 that Canaan, and that was a descendant of Ham, Canaan was going to become the servants of Shem and Japheth. And so kind of keep that in mind as we're going through this chapter and talking about the beginning of these nations. The first thing that I want to think about from this chapter is the formation of these nations. And you kind of get an idea as you read in the first part of the chapter that mankind is once again multiplying and beginning to fill the earth. In verse 1 it says, "Now these are the generations of the son of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were sons born after the flood." Well, we talked about and read in Genesis chapter 9 this morning how God had gave the commandment to Noah and to his family to replenish the earth. And so that's what we're reading about here. We're reading about the sons of Noah filling the earth. They have sons, and they have sons, and they have sons. Pretty soon, the descendants of Noah and of his 3 sons are once again occupying the earth. It is interesting to read through the chapter, and what you kind of have is a record of the development of these descendants and the dispersion, how they divided up and how they spread out from one another. One person said that Genesis chapter 10 is a genealogy and an atlas and a history book all in one. And I thought about that for a while, but there's a lot of truth to that. You have a genealogy, you have a family tree that's given there. You also have an atlas in the sense that there are geographical divisions that are given there where these certain descendants go and travel in the cities that they establish. And then you have a history book in that you have a record of some of what these descendants did. So you're having a lot of things that are going on within this chapter, but we're basically watching the movement of these people and the development of these nations. If you go down and look in verse 5, it says, "By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his own tongue, after their families, in their nations." specifically talking about the sons or the descendants of Japheth in the first part of this chapter. But what it's telling us is each of these families developed unique identities and unique nations. Each one had his own family. They had their own spouse, they had their own children, they had their own family tree. Each one had their own territory. They had a certain part of the land where they were living and they were dwelling. Each one had their own language, and they spoke that language. Some of those lines may have crossed, but each of these had their own language that they spoke. And I want to emphasize to you, as we're reading here in chapter 10, we're just kind of reading about all these different nations. This actually takes place after Genesis chapter 11, which makes a lot more sense as to how they came about. But we're just kind of talking about the idea, the general idea of these nations and how they were divided and how they were basically their own separate entities operating in their own territory, speaking their own language, having their own descendants. And as you're reading through this chapter, you come across a favorable descendant here of Shem in verses 8 through 9. It says there that Cush begat Nimrod, and he became to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Well, the chapter moves from the descendants of Japheth in the first part to the descendants of Shem. And one of the most famous descendants of Shem, or at least in that particular day and age, was a man by the name of Nimrod. Now, we made mention in Genesis chapter 9 when we studied this morning how God instilled the fear of man into animals. And so now men had to become hunters in order to get these animals, in order to capture them and to eat them and to have meat. Well, Nimrod became an expert in that area. Evidently, he was better than all the people who had come before them. He superseded them in his skills and in his knowledge and ability to capture and to hunt these animals. But he was also, notice there it mentions in the middle part of verse 8, he began to be a mighty one in the earth. And what I think about when I read that is I think about back to the days of Noah. And you remember you had all these physical giants, these people who were becoming like super leaders in the earth. All the people were looking toward them because of their size and their physical advantage. And all the people were following them because of this. Well, Nimrod kind of becomes that super leader in the new world. He kind of becomes this one individual that all people are looking to. He possesses all these superior skills and knowledge. And so they're looking to him and kind of following after him. In fact, he was such a knowledgeable and a superior man that it actually became a saying in that day and age. To be like Nimrod was to be like a mighty person or superior person. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when we were kids, we always used Nimrod in a derogatory way. And if you look it up in the English language, that's basically what it means. It means a foolish person or an inept person. Well, shouldn't surprise us that the Bible uses it in exactly the opposite manner that we use it in our society today. It was actually a compliment in that day and age if somebody called you Nimrod. So you read about one of those great descendants, kind of keep him in mind because he comes back into the picture as to how these different nations came to be about. But if you go through chapter 10, there's a lot of information. There's a lot of geographical information. There's a lot about ethnic divisions, things like that, the dispersion of people after the flood. I'm not going to go into all those details, but like I said, if you really want to get down and study it, you can kind of divide those up and get some interesting ideas and pictures of the nations that even occupy the earth today. Well, we're reading about all these people, and obviously when Noah and his family come off the ark and they have all these people, they've got to be united. They've got to be one nation. So the question becomes, how did all this one group of people become fractured into all these different nations? Like I said, chapter 10 is actually, should probably make more sense if it came after chapter 11, because of the events that happened there kind of explain how all these different nations came about. But we know that God had a lot to do with fracturing this kind of united race of mankind back up into smaller categories, so to speak. And the fracturing of this nation, it begins with the attitude of mankind. I've labeled it the footloose and fancy-free attitude. I picked F for alliteration, and I was running short on this one. I racked my brain for a while, and this is all I could think about. But it does accurately represent the attitude of that one society or nation. And basically their attitude was, we don't need anyone and we don't need anything. We can do everything for ourselves. And Nimrod kind of became the key leader and the key force in that movement. And so if you look in verse 10, it's again talking about Nimrod. He was a mighty hunter, but there were a lot of other things that he excelled at. It says the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, or Babel, some people call it, in Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So among all these magnificent achievements that Nimrod made, one of them was the building of the city of Babel. Now, I wasn't going to go into chapter 11 tonight because obviously our text is Genesis chapter 10. But if you look at Genesis chapter 10, like I said, all you got is a bunch of names, and I didn't want to really put in the effort to try to get something out of all those. So I'm going to go to chapter 11. And I was kind of hesitant to do that because if we're going in order, that's going to be the next lesson. But I made mention some time ago, actually next week we're going to shift over to the character of Job. And the Tower of Babel lesson is 76 lessons away. So that's going to be a year and a half. If you guys remember what I said tonight, a year and a half later, more power to you. So, but it's going to be a while for you actually talk about that. By the time we get there, I'll have forgotten what I said, and probably most of you will too. So we're going to look just a little bit at chapter 11 and talk about, again, how God came down and how he divided these nations. Now, all the people who gathered there at Babel, the Bible tells us that they all spoke the same language. And they set about to accomplish a great task, and that was they were going to build this monument that would reach into the heavens. Some people believe that they were trying to put themselves on the level of God. They were going to reach the height of God, and they were going to be equal to God. I don't know if that was their mindset behind it, but I do know this. It was quite a task to set out to accomplish. In fact, when you think about the limited and the crude resources that they have, it was a monumental, not to make a pun, but it was a monumental task that they were setting out upon. In Genesis chapter 11 and verse 3, we read about how they had to make brick, and they were going to burn them thoroughly. Can you imagine building a tower that reached into the heaven with bricks? One by one, they would make these bricks, and they would stack them up until eventually this tower led into the heavens. So they had these very limited resources. They had brick for stone. They had slime for mortar. And in verse 4 of Genesis chapter 11, they clearly stated what their objective was. They said, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto the heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Some people see this as the first humanistic society. And basically a humanistic society, again, has the philosophy, we don't need help from anyone and everything. We're going to trust in ourselves in order to accomplish whatever we want to accomplish. So they were trusting in their own ability in order to survive in this world. They were going to promote their own interests. They didn't need anybody else telling them what to do or where to go. They were going to do what they wanted to do. And they were going to protect themselves from everyone and everything. They had a goal. They had an objective in constructing this tower. Well, we know that God is not unaware of what happens here upon earth. And so what we read about next is we read how God comes down and he frustrates this one united nation into many different nations. In fact, if you look in verse 5 of Genesis chapter 11, it says, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. It reminds me of some of the things that have happened previously in the history of mankind. Whenever Adam and Eve sinned, was God unaware? No, he knew exactly what happened, and when it happened, he came down to try to work things out. You think about Noah and the flood, the world that Noah was living in. Was God unaware of what was happening upon earth? No, he wasn't. He came down, he investigated, he intervened, and he said, this is what's going to happen. Well, you have the same idea or the same concept in this Tower of Babel. God is concerned about what's going on here. Man is becoming, with this mindset, once again, he's going to be self-sufficient. He's going to be independent of God. He doesn't need anyone. He doesn't need anything. He's going to take care of himself. He's going to accomplish these things all on his own. And so what I think you have is, why does God do this? I don't think God would have done it if the human race wasn't in danger. Again, when you see God coming down and intervening, there's a reason why God does the things that he's doing. He sees them going down this same road that they have started going down or went down in the days of Noah, and God said, I've got to intervene or things aren't going to turn out well. Well, what's he going to do? He already promised he wasn't going to curse the earth anymore. He already promised there wasn't going to be another universal reconstruction of the earth. And so now he says, I've got to do something to break up this pattern and to divide the people. Think about why there are so many different nations and languages today. Isn't it the great wisdom of God? Think about if all of us were united and all of us were headed down the same path. What happens if that's the wrong path? Well, the human race is doomed, isn't it? God has dispersed people into groups, into nations, into different languages. And part of what that does is if one nation goes astray, the other one is still independent and allows it to operate freely up. So God comes down and he intervenes. He frustrates the language of these people. And so we read in verses 7 through 9 of Genesis chapter 11. In verse 8 it says, So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off building the building. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord there did confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. What was the result of God's intervention? Well, the result was that all these people dispersed into different groups throughout the world. God has rejected their attempt to become self-sufficient. He's rebuked their attempt to reach themselves up to his level. And so you have this name, Babel. It's kind of a pun in and of itself because we actually get our English word Babel from it. But it kind of describes to you what went on whenever God came down there and confounded the language of the people. Now, eventually that word came to mean something much different. The gates of the gods, it's actually the word Babylon that's used many times throughout the Old Testament. But originally it meant confusion. And so, I don't know about you, but have you ever tried to communicate with somebody who speaks a different language? I know I've made mention before, but a number of years ago, right before Josh was born, I was blessed with the opportunity to go to Japan and do some missionary work. And I went there with a missionary couple. The woman was actually from Japan. The man was American. But before I went over there, they did a little bit of training with me. And so they taught me how to count money so I could go to the store and, I knew what things cost and I could buy things. They also taught me a little bit of Japanese. I could say yes and no and please and thank you and basically say my name. But I say that to say that helped in communicating a little bit with people. But could you imagine? You have no idea about any language. You don't have any idea about what a word means. You have no training. You have no experience. You have no interaction with this. And all of a sudden you're introduced to a person like that. I mean, what would be the result? Well, it would be Babel. That would be the result of it. There'd be utter chaos and confusion. Nobody would understand anything that anybody else is saying. So the only way you could ever understand anything is to go with a group that speaks your language. And that's what happened. God dispersed these people throughout the earth by confounding their language. And so the Bible tells us in short order how all these different languages and nations came to be. And the rest of the time that we have tonight, I want to spend talking about the future of these nations. And I'm actually going to back up to Genesis chapter 9, the end of that chapter. Now, don't fret, I'm not rewinding here and then we're going to have to replay chapter 10 again. We're going to end in Genesis chapter 9 tonight. But it is interesting there that Noah gave a prophecy concerning the future of these nations. And what that prophecy involved, the first thing that it involved, was a failure of a certain nation. In fact, go back to verse 24 of Genesis chapter 9. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his younger son had done to him, and he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. You have this prophetic curse that is uttered by Noah, that the descendants of Ham, represented by Canaan, his son, they were going to become servants of the descendants of Shem and Japheth. And so what you have represented in that, you have all these different nations that are represented by these individuals. Some nations were going to become servants to other nations. You read about all these different men. Again, I'm not going to go into the different areas that they went and the different nations that they formed, but it is an interesting study in and of itself. I guess we should mention that Ham, the descendants of Ham, are most famous for the Canaanites. That's why he's named after his son Canaan. And so we know what happened to the Canaanites, don't we? We know how God brought the descendants of Shem into the land and how they conquered them and how the Canaanites became their servants. That's what Noah is prophesying about here. And so Jesus understood the same principle, and it's always been a principle. Wherever you have multiple nations, you're going to have national conflict. I mean, it's just as simple as wherever you have human individuals, you're going to have individual conflicts. But there's always going to be national conflicts. And the Bible emphasizes that point. Jesus in his day, in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 7, he said, "Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom shall rise against kingdom." Well, Noah prophesied of one of these events, one of these national conflicts, and it came true. And there was victory for some nations, there was defeat for others. But what I want to emphasize to you is the defeat and the victories did not necessarily define the worth of nations in the sight of God. In other words, it doesn't necessarily mean that one nation is worth more in the sight of God than another nation. We know that God loves all of us as individuals, that we're all have worth and value in the sight of God, and no person is valuable above another. My soul isn't more valuable than your soul. And one nation in the sight of God isn't more valuable than another nation. We read about the failure of these nations, but understand that doesn't mean that they didn't have any worth in the eyes of God. We also read about the fruition of two other nations, the descendants, or at least two other, the descendants of Shem and the descendants of Japheth. And the Bible reminds us that in spite of all of our external differences when it comes to nationalities, we talk about that, there's the language barrier, there's geographical barriers, all those different things that separate us and make us different from one another. But despite all of those things, we're really the same in the sight of God, aren't we? Paul talked about this idea in Acts chapter 17 and verse 26 when he's preaching to the men of Athens, and he's talking about this unknown God. But he tells them, "This unknown God hath made of one blood all nations. And he put them on the face of the earth to dwell where he wants. He hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation." So regardless of what nation, what nationality, or what descendant we belong to, the Bible teaches us that we all have worth. And so there's no race or there's no people that should claim superiority over another. There's no nation that should claim superiority over another. Now, is it true that God has predetermined what these nations are going to do and where they're going to go? Well, that's what Paul preached, wasn't it? God knew this from the beginning of time. He's predetermined their bounds, their habitations, but they're all the same. They all have the same blood coursing through their veins. God makes some nations permits some nations to make greater progress than others. Some progress more economically. Some progress more socially. Some progress more politically. Those achievements, those economic achievements, don't necessarily prove that one nation is more valuable in the sight of God than another. I like the way that Solomon put it in Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 2. He said, "The rich and the poor meet together. The Lord is the maker of them all." What Solomon is saying there is, it doesn't matter if you're rich or if you're poor, guess who made you both? You both came from God. And so one doesn't have an advantage over another. The same is true when we're talking about whether we're the descendants of Shem or we're the descendants of Ham or we're the descendants of Japheth. God made all of us. And so we all share the same or the common ground. And God does choose certain nations and certain individuals to do certain things to accomplish his purpose. We know that. Now, that choosing many times is largely based upon a nation's reaction to God or an individual's reaction to God. Basically, what the Bible teaches us is this: we're either going to be a pawn in the hands of God for good or evil. And that's true of any nation. Any nation is going to be a pawn in the hand of God as to accomplish good or to accomplish evil. The choice is up to us, but we're going to be a pawn in the hand of God. And so nations are used by God, whether they're good, whether they're evil. And just because one might prosper more than another economically doesn't mean that it's more important in the sight of God. I think God's concern for all the nations is seen in the Great Commission. Remember when Jesus commanded his disciples in Mark 16:15? He said, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." What does God want for every nation and every person in the world? God wants for all of us to come to know him and to serve him. And while Israel takes center stage in the Old Testament, understand part of the reason why it takes center stage is God's showing what he's doing through this nation. But what you learn when you read the Bible is God was also working with Egypt, wasn't he? God was also working with Babylon. He was also working with Assyria and the Medes and the Persians and the Roman Empire. And he was using all of those nations to accomplish his great plan and purpose for mankind. I guess the great lesson that we need to take home from tonight's sermon is God is the Lord of nations. God created us. God can use us. God can dispose of us however he sees fit. And you read about Noah's 3 sons. They left a legacy in the world. But even though they had their own legacy and they had their own nations, what we learn is God was still in charge. And human history is still the story of God. Not man's story, but God's story. Maybe there's one here tonight who has never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ. The Lord's invitation is open for you to do that at this time.